Welcome to this Silicon Wafers video. It's appearing on the main channel, but this really is a teaser for videos that are going to be added to a new channel, which is going to be showing daily deep dives into news stories relating to Russia and Ukraine. So do please enjoy this video on Silicon Curtain, but follow the link to Silicon Wafers, subscribe so you don't miss out on the content that is going to be added there as frequently as I can, and there will be lots of new format videos on that channel to enjoy. And I hope to do a lot more interaction with the audience, FAQs, and videos on topics which the audience suggests. So please do add to the comments any ideas you have about how Silicon Wafers could grow and evolve to become hopefully as useful as the main channel is. For once, it seems there is good news, and this is being reported on in a variety of sources. The news is still being updated as I record this, so I'm sure once it's published, plenty more will be known about the prisoner exchange, which has been taking place today, 1st of August, 2024. Political prisoners were released today in an absolutely historic exchange. It's quite possible that even during the Cold War, nothing of this scale was actually achieved, because it is an absolutely massive exchange of political prisoners. And many of the people who are being released, and we'll come to some of their names in a minute, very few of us expected to actually see them alive, not just because of the conditions in which they're being kept, but for some of them, it was the state of their health that meant that those conditions really exacerbated health risks, especially for people like Oleg Orlov and Vladmir Kara-Murza. Their release today is quite literally, for some of them, a stay of execution. And another reason why we suspected that we may not see them again is because when Putin takes his vengeance on people, the assumption is that they will not make it out of prison alive. They will either rot there for as long as Putin and his vile regime continue, or they will succumb to the conditions of their imprisonment. But numerous names are now being confirmed in the prisoner swap, and these are genuinely good and brave people. Vladmir Kara-Murza, Oleg Orlov, Ilya Yashin, Gershkovich, and many others, some of whom are far lesser known dissidents, such as Liliya Chernysheva, Ksenia Fadeeva, Chalenko, Vadim Astanin, and it is rumored many others besides. And of course, these exchanges are likely to be an incredibly complex process. There have, of course, been some rumors that have been emerging, certainly over the last couple of days and even many weeks ago, before Alexei Navalny was potentially killed in prison. Rumors were swirling about a potential prison release involving him. But I think even at that time, no one suspected that it might be as large a scale release as this. And we'll come back to Alexei Navalny in a minute, because already it's been discussing whether he was murdered in prison to prevent him being released in the prison exchange that has happened today. And of course, to make this release happen, many officials, many governments would have been involved, and keeping it secret, keeping the details under wraps are absolutely critical to ensuring that it actually takes place. Anything that leaks out may have destroyed or prevented this exchange from actually happening. And it seems this has been highly successful. Even people in the Russian so-called democratic opposition, many of those who are very close to the people who were released today, few of them, I think, suspected that these negotiations were in progress. Few of them expected to see their friends and colleagues again. And of course, we know from past examples that excessive publicity definitely interferes and destroys the background of these kind of negotiations. So keeping all this a secret is actually an extraordinary achievement. And we have to point out as well that many, of course, have been slating Scholz and Biden, but it would have taken considerable investment of their time and resources and many hundreds of people on their teams to actually conduct a detailed negotiation such as this one. It must be a complex, a many months long, risky operation which could have failed at any moment. And of course, as I say, involves a large number of people. But they managed to keep it confidential until the very end. And what has Russia received? Well, it's clear that to some Western countries now are coming a number of US citizens, a number of Russian citizens, but some genuinely powerful voices, people who are some of the leading lights in the so-called Russian opposition and Russian civic society. They may now be able to resume their activities in opposing Putin's government in exile. These are truly some very, very strong and powerful voices and minds who will be released from Putin's gulag. But what is he getting in return? He's getting killers, spies, and cyber terrorists. People like the killer Krasnikov, who is being held prisoner in Berlin, and there are some other GRU officers amongst them, cyber hackers, and so on. But they are not names that are as well known as those who are being released on the Russian side. And I think this is an important point to make. Russia has gone out of its way to capture and hold prisoners. You could even call them hostages. In the West, this has not happened. So potentially we had far fewer people to negotiate such a swap for. And it has been pointed out by Vladimir Milov and others as well that Putin has been very much personally involved in the tracking and arresting of Western citizens over the last couple of years. And they must have done this fully mindful that these people had not committed crimes, fully mindful that Western governments would be prepared to negotiate their release, mindful that this gave them hostages, that this gave them leverage for future scenarios such as this one. And also it must be remembered that Biden, Schultz, and whoever else was involved in this has really put some thought into who they would negotiate the release for. Yes, there's some high-profile names, but also there's a lot of people who we really, very few, unless you're following this or watching Silicon Bites, there are names that you will not have heard of. So, of course, Biden is not going to get a huge amount of political kudos from this. Some of these names are not going to earn Biden a huge number of votes in the forthcoming election. All this effort has been done for the act itself, for showing support and alliance with democratic forces in Russia. That is an extraordinarily powerful moral stance, I think, that Biden has taken here to put so much energy, resource, and effort into getting these people released when actually he is not going to be earning, I think, a huge amount of political capital from it. And how do Putin's forces operate? Again, as Vladimir Milov has pointed out, Russian security forces look for the passports of Western citizens with a view to taking hostages. This is why so many Western governments have advised their citizens not to go near Russia. Some, however, in the course of their jobs, had no real choice. In fact, they felt it was their imperative, their duty to go and report on events in Russia. For instance, the journalist Evan Gershkovich, who understood exactly what kind of threats he was facing by going to Russia. Nevertheless, he continued the very important journalistic work that he was conducting there. And he paid for it with a lengthy term in a Russian prison. Not many in Ukraine will say that there is no genuine democratic movement in Russia, that there is no chance of a democratic revolution. However, we must support anyone who is prepared to resist Putin's regime. We must support anyone who risks their own freedom and life in order to expose the lies of Putin's regime. And many of the people who are being released from Russian prisons were doing exactly these things before their arrest. So it is fantastic news that they will be getting out, and potentially they'll be able to scale up these activities once they settle down to life in the Western countries that they will be delivered to. And let's look at some of the lesser known names. For instance, Liliya Chernysheva. She is one of the longest serving prisoners out of all those who are being released. She was actually arrested before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, and that happened in the autumn of 2021. So she spent almost 3 years in prison. And the irony, the horrible irony here, is that just before she was taken prisoner by Putin's regime, she had actually announced that she was suspending her political activities. She had been the coordinator of Navalny's headquarters in Bashkiria. But despite the declarations that she was going to drop political activity, she was torn away from her friends and family. She was mocked and abused and thrown into prison, and for some time her relatives had no contact with her at all. Ksenia Fadeeva spent a long time under house arrest and also announced that she would no longer be engaging in political activity, but this did not save her from becoming another hostage to Putin's regime. She seemed like such a fragile character, explains Vladmir Kara-Murza, who shouldered an enormous responsibility and took on enormous political work onto her shoulders, and as a result won a brilliant victory in the elections to the Tomsk City Duma. Now, someone who can achieve this, who can achieve an extraordinary victory in what essentially is a hybrid autocracy, and in that election she was literally just a few votes short of becoming the chairman of the Tomsk City Parliament. She managed to compete on equal terms with the candidates who were supported by the ruling party. These are the stooges of Putin's regime, and to almost win such an extraordinary victory, that is deeply threatening to a dictator such as Putin. Now, we're going to give a lot more details in Silicon Bites coming up, and of course these details are coming out all the time. But it's worth understanding here what is involved in this prisoner exchange. Putin really sees no value, I think, in the people he is giving up, handing over. He sees potentially no threat for them as well. He sees that they have no value for the kind of Russia that he is creating, the kind of regime and its supporters that he needs. He values murder, political assassinations, thuggery, sabotage, arson. He values people who are prepared to kill and steal for him and for his kleptocratic elite. He has no need of the wonderful, beautiful, strong, clever people who are being released in this prisoner exchange. Putin's Russia today needs scum, says Vladmir Kara-Murza. He needs criminals and murderers. He does not need civic society activists, Democrats, artists, people who are prepared to express their own minds. These are entirely superfluous people for him and his regime. And there is an interesting argument, discussion breaking out in Russian diaspora circles, and actually it's one that's been going on for some time. We know that Navalny actually returned from exile in the West. Navalny was recovering from his poisoning, but there is this extraordinary atmosphere, extraordinary criticism, even amongst many of the Russian diaspora, some who are actually in exile for political reasons, not just for economic reasons. There's a belief that if you lose contact with Russia, if you are outside of Russia, then you lose the connection to the people, to the society, that you can't do anything there. You can't be an oppositionist. You can't bring down Putin's regime. This is unfortunately a myth which Navalny bought into. It's a myth which essentially sealed his fate. When he decided to return, it was tantamount to a death sentence. If it had not been for this prisoner exchange, many, many others who have been released now likely would have also died in Putin's custody. So this is a toxic, lethal belief that you can only be an oppositionist in Russia, that you cannot build a democratic opposition in exile. Well, this belief needs to change. And in the video, the link I'm going to put in the description by Vladimir Kara-Murza, he absolutely castigates people who are still putting forward this argument. As he rightly says, this is an argument that only helps Putin's regime, and anybody now who returns to Russia, who is on the radar as an oppositionist, well, their chances of getting out of this alive are extremely low. So nobody should be under any delusions about returning now. Equally, those who are being released should have a degree of optimism that they can achieve extraordinary things abroad, that they can lay the foundations for a democratic transformation of Russia. These things are possible, these things are necessary. And it has been shown in this prisoner exchange that the Biden administration is giving physical and moral support to those who would seek to oppose and bring down Putin's regime. And history shows that this idea of being an impotent exile bears no relation to reality. Even Russian history, there are plenty of examples. For instance, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin spent a considerable period abroad, laying the foundations for the Bolshevik regime. That maybe isn't the best example because that is not something people who are Democrats should aspire to, but it does show you that if you're determined, you can achieve a lot while in exile. And there are other examples as well. Charles de Gaulle, Paul Henry, many others who have carried on resistance to dictatorial regimes abroad, and when they do return to their countries, are able to become part of its new democratic identity, are able to form its institutions and even lead countries after periods of exile. So as Milov implores the Russian diaspora, stop talking about how it is essential to return to Russia. Stop suggesting that you cannot be a Democrat in exile, that somehow that is the death of your political activity. It's not. That is a toxic myth which only benefits the Putin regime. Well, this is an extraordinary exchange. This is an absolutely historic day. It does not mean the war is over. It does not, in fact, mean that Putin is renouncing his goals of destroying Ukraine. And to end this short episode, we need to rejoice at the release of these prisoners, but we have to remember Ukraine, its devastated cities, the many tens and tens of thousands of civilians and military personnel who have died in the heroic defense of their country. And we can only hope that somehow the Russian diaspora in opposition can unite behind the idea of Ukrainian victory and can unite behind the idea of supporting Ukraine in any way possible, because Ukraine is the best chance of resisting the Putin regime in its current form. It is the best chance of inflicting a devastating defeat on Putin. In fact, it is the best chance of bringing the Putin regime down and clearing the way for hopefully positive developments in that country and, of course, a secure future for Ukraine and its people, free of Russian meddling, free of Russian aggression, free of Russian terrorism.